I never imagined my life would be worth exactly $1 million. That's what my father's debt amounted to, $1 million owed to people I'd never met, for reasons I'd never understand. And on a cold October evening, 3 days before my 24th birthday, I learned that I was the payment. The men who came to our apartment didn't knock. They simply walked in, their expensive shoes clicking against our worn linoleum floor like a countdown to something inevitable. My father stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his face drained of all color, while my mother gripped the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. I was folding laundry on the couch, my hands full of my younger brother's school shirts, when the tallest man spoke. Like and subscribe if you love listening these stories. Mr. Chen, we've been patient. 3 years is long enough. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but it carried the weight of a threat that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I watched my father's shoulders cave inward, watched him shrink before these strangers in our home, and something inside me cracked. This was the man who'd worked double shifts at the factory, who'd missed family dinners and birthday parties to provide for us. Seeing him reduced to this trembling shadow made my chest tighten with a anger I didn't know I possessed. "I need more time," my father whispered. "Please. Just another few months." "There is no more time." The tall man's gaze shifted then, sliding across the room until it landed on me. His eyes were dark and assessing, and I felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see every secret I'd ever kept. "Unless you have something else of value." The silence that followed was suffocating. I watched my father's face transform from confusion to horror to something worse, resignation. My mother made a small, wounded sound. And I understood, in that terrible moment, exactly what was being proposed. "No." The word left my mouth before I could think. "No, you can't, Lena, don't." My father's voice broke. "Please, just go to your room." But I was already standing, the laundry forgotten on the floor. "What are you saying? What do they want?" The tall man smiled then, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Not they, Miss Chen. He. My employer is willing to forgive your father's debt entirely, plus interest, in exchange for a very simple arrangement. Marriage." The word hung in the air like smoke. Marriage. As if it were that simple. As if my entire life could be reduced to a transaction, a line item in some criminal's ledger. "She's just a girl," my mother said desperately. "She's studying to be a teacher. She has her whole life ahead of her, and she can still have that life. A much better one, in fact." The man pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, crisp and white against the dark fabric. "Your daughter will want for nothing. The finest home, unlimited resources, protection, respect. All she has to do is sign a marriage certificate and play the role of a devoted wife. That's all. That's all." As if selling myself to a stranger was nothing. As if I should be grateful for the opportunity. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw tears streaming down his weathered face. This man had given everything for our family, had sacrificed his health and happiness to keep us fed and sheltered. And now he was being asked to sacrifice me. The weight of that realization settled over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating us all. My little brother, Kai, was at his friend's house. He didn't know any of this was happening. He was only 16, still young enough to believe the world was fair, that hard work was rewarded, and families stayed together. If these men took my father away, or worse, what would happen to him? What would happen to my mother? "How long?" I heard myself ask. My voice sounded strange, distant, as if someone else was speaking through me. "How long would this marriage last?" "Lena, no," my father started, but the tall man cut him off. "That depends entirely on my employer, but I can assure you, he's not looking for love. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll have your own quarters, your own life. You just need to appear at his side when required and keep his household running smoothly. Think of it as a job with exceptional benefits. A job. A job where I was the product being sold." But even as revulsion twisted in my stomach, I was doing the math. $1 million. That debt had hung over our family like a storm cloud for 3 years, turning my father into an anxious ghost and my mother into someone who flinched at every unexpected sound. They'd taken out the loan to pay for my grandmother's cancer treatment, had signed papers with people they shouldn't have trusted because the hospital bills were drowning us. And even after my grandmother passed, the debt remained, growing larger with each passing month. If I did this, if I agreed to this insane arrangement, my family would be free. Kai could finish school without watching our parents slowly crumble under the weight of their fear. My mother could sleep through the night again. My father could hold his head up without shame. All it would cost was my life. My dreams of becoming a teacher, of maybe meeting someone kind and building something real. My freedom. I need to know who he is, I said quietly. I need to know who I'd be marrying. The tall man's smile widened slightly, as if I'd passed some kind of test. His name is Damien Volkov. I'm sure you've heard of his family. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Volkov. Even people who tried to avoid the city's underworld knew that name. The Volkovs weren't just criminals, they were an empire. They owned half the businesses in the city, controlled the ports, had politicians and police officers in their pockets. Crossing the Volkovs meant disappearing. Owing them money meant a lifetime of servitude or a very short lifespan. He's the head of the family, the man continued, watching my reaction with obvious amusement. 32 years old, highly educated, and in need of a wife for personal reasons I'm not at liberty to discuss. You'd be Mrs. Volkov, with all the power and protection that title carries. Consider it carefully, Miss Chen. This offer expires when I walk out that door. My hands were shaking. I clasped them together, digging my nails into my palms to ground myself in something real, something I could control. In the movies, this was where the heroine would fight back, would find some clever way to outsmart the villains and save everyone. But this wasn't a movie. This was my life, and the only choice I had was between sacrificing myself or sacrificing my entire family. If I agree, I said slowly, forcing the words past the lump in my throat, my family's debt is completely forgiven? They'll be left alone? You have my word. And the word of Damien Volkov, which I assure you is more valuable than any written contract. I looked at my mother, whose face was streaked with tears, then at my father, who couldn't even meet my eyes. They'd spent 3 years trying to protect me from this moment, working themselves to exhaustion to keep me safe. And now the only way I could protect them was to walk away. Okay, I whispered. I'll do it. The sound my mother made was almost inhuman, a cry of pure anguish that would haunt me for years to come. My father dropped to his knees, sobbing openly, and I wanted to go to them, wanted to comfort them, and tell them it would be okay. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the center of our small living room while the tall man pulled papers from his briefcase, while he explained where I needed to sign, while he scheduled the ceremony for 3 days from now. 3 days. I had 3 days to say goodbye to my life. The wedding, if you could call it that, took place in a private room at City Hall on a Thursday morning. I wore a simple white dress my mother had bought from a department store clearance rack, her hands trembling as she helped me zip it up in the courthouse bathroom. There were no flowers, no music, no guests except for the tall man who'd brokered this arrangement and a woman in a severe black suit who I assumed was some kind of lawyer. And then there was Damien Volkov. He arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who positioned themselves at the door like sentries. I'd expected someone intimidating, someone whose appearance would match his reputation. What I didn't expect was the man who walked through that door. Damien Volkov was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, sharp, cold, and dangerous. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His hair was dark and immaculately styled, his jawline could have been carved from marble, and his eyes, those eyes were the color of smoke and just as impossible to read. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine, not at the head of a criminal empire. He barely glanced at me before speaking to the official in a low, authoritative voice that somehow filled the entire room. Let's make this quick. That was it. No greeting, no acknowledgement of what was happening, nothing. I was marrying a stranger who couldn't even be bothered to look at his bride. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. The official droned through the legal language while I stood beside a man who smelled like expensive cologne and power. When it came time to exchange rings, Damien produced a simple platinum band that slid onto my finger with surprising ease. I had nothing to give him, but he didn't seem to expect anything. He signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, his handwriting bold and decisive, then finally turned to face me. Up close, he was even more striking and even more terrifying. Those gray eyes studied me with the intensity of a predator, assessing prey, taking in every detail of my face with clinical precision. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to not flinch or look away, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. "You're younger than I expected," he said quietly. His voice was deep and measured, the kind of voice that commanded attention without needing to rise in volume. "You're exactly what I expected," I replied before I could stop myself. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or amusement. It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Good. At least you're not naive." He glanced at the official. "We're done here?" "Yes, Mr. Volkov. Congratulations to you both." Damien made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust. I couldn't tell which. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, clearly expecting me to follow. I looked back at my parents one last time. My mother was crying silently, clutching my father's arm. My father mouthed something that looked like, "I'm sorry," and I wanted to scream, wanted to tell him none of this was his fault, wanted to stay in this moment where I was still their daughter and not some stranger's wife. But Damien was waiting, and I'd already made my choice. I followed him out of City Hall and into a world I knew nothing about. The car that waited for us was unlike anything I'd ever seen outside of movies, a sleek black vehicle with windows so dark I couldn't see inside. One of Damien's guards opened the door, and I hesitated for just a second before climbing in. The interior was all leather and wood, more luxurious than my family's entire apartment. Damien slid in beside me, and the door closed with a solid, final-sounding thunk. We didn't speak as the car pulled away from the curb. I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood slide past the window, each block taking me further from everything I'd ever known. Damien was typing something on his phone, his attention completely focused on the screen, as if he'd already forgotten I existed. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" I finally asked, breaking the oppressive silence. "Home," he said without looking up. "Our home. You'll have time to settle in before tonight." "What's tonight?" Now he did look at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach clench. "A dinner party. Several important families will be attending, and they'll expect to meet my new wife. I trust you can play the role convincingly?" Play the role. As if I were an actress he'd hired, not a woman he'd just married. "I'm not an idiot. I can handle a dinner party." "Good. Because the people you'll meet tonight are not forgiving of mistakes. They'll be watching you, judging you, looking for any weakness they can exploit. You smile, you're gracious, you say as little as possible, and you stay by my side. Can you do that?" I wanted to snap at him, to tell him exactly what I thought of his orders and his condescending tone. But I'd signed up for this. I'd agreed to be his wife, to play this part, and backing out now wouldn't save my family. So I swallowed my pride and nodded. "I can do that. We'll see." He returned his attention to his phone, effectively dismissing me. I turned back to the window and watched the city change around us. We left my neighborhood behind, moving through the downtown business district and then into areas I'd only ever seen on television. The buildings grew taller and more elegant, the cars more expensive, the people on the sidewalks more polished. This was a different world, one where people like me didn't belong, and with every mile we traveled, I felt more like an imposter wearing a costume. Finally, the car turned onto a private road lined with old trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. At the end of the drive stood a house that made me forget how to breathe. It wasn't just large, it was a mansion, 3 stories of classic architecture, with tall windows and a grand entrance that looked like something from a period drama. Gardens stretched out on either side, immaculately maintained, and a fountain sparkled in the circular driveway. "This is where you live?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Where we live, Damien corrected, though his tone suggested he found the distinction unimportant. You're Mrs. Volkov now. Act like it. The car stopped at the front entrance, and immediately a man in a butler's uniform appeared to open the door. He greeted Damien with a respectful nod, then turned to me with something that might have been curiosity in his weathered face. Mrs. Volkov, welcome. I'm James, the head of household staff. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you, I managed, climbing out of the car on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. Damien was already striding toward the entrance, his phone still in his hand. I hurried to follow, my cheap department store heels clicking awkwardly against the stone steps. The front door opened into a foyer that was larger than my family's entire apartment. Marble floors, a sweeping staircase, artwork on the walls that probably cost more than my father's annual salary. Everything gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that spoke of a full-time staff dedicated to maintaining perfection. Elena will show you to your room, Damien said, gesturing to a young woman in a maid's uniform who'd appeared from somewhere. Get some rest. Hair and makeup will arrive at 4 to prepare you for tonight. Don't be late. Wait, I called as he turned to leave. That's it. You're not going to show me around or explain anything? He paused, looking back at me with an expression of mild annoyance. Elena knows the house better than I do. She'll answer your questions. I have work to do. And then he was gone, disappearing down a hallway without a backward glance. I stood in that massive foyer, fighting the urge to sink to the floor and cry. Instead, I turned to Elena, who was watching me with sympathetic eyes. She looked to be in her late 20s, with kind features and a gentle smile. It's overwhelming at first, she said softly. But you'll get used to it. Come on, I'll show you your suite. My suite, not our suite. That detail didn't escape my notice as I followed Elena up the grand staircase. She led me down a hallway lined with closed doors, pointing out various rooms, guest bedrooms, a library, a home gym before finally stopping at a door near the end of the hall. This is yours, she said, pushing it open. I stepped inside and immediately understood why Damien had specified your room. This wasn't a bedroom, it was an apartment. A sitting area with plush sofas and a fireplace, a bedroom visible through an archway with a bed large enough for 4 people, what looked like a walk-in closet the size of my old bedroom, and glimpses of a marble bathroom beyond. Everything was decorated in soft creams and grays, elegant and expensive and utterly impersonal. Mr. Volkov's suite is at the other end of the hall, Elena explained, confirming what I'd already guessed. You'll have complete privacy here. There's a call button by the bed if you need anything, and meals are served in the main dining room unless you prefer to eat in your suite. Where does Damien eat? I asked. Usually in his study. Mr. Volkov works quite a lot. Of course he did. This marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more. I shouldn't have expected anything different. Thank you, Elena. I think I'd like to be alone for a while. She nodded and slipped out quietly, closing the door behind her. As soon as I was alone, the composure I'd been fighting to maintain crumbled. I sank onto one of the sofas and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. In the span of 3 days, I'd gone from being a college student with a normal life to being the wife of a mafia boss, living in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home, married to a man who could barely stand to look at me. I pulled off the platinum band on my finger and studied it in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. It was beautiful, simple, and elegant, and it fit perfectly. Damien must have known my ring size somehow, must have taken the time to have this made. But that small gesture of consideration was overshadowed by everything else: the coldness in his eyes, the dismissive way he treated me, the clear message that I was an obligation he'd rather not deal with. I thought about my family, hoped they were okay, hoped this sacrifice would actually mean something. Then I slipped the ring back on, went to the enormous bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. I had a dinner party to survive, and if nothing else, I was going to prove to Damien Volkov that I was more than just another problem he'd purchased. The hair and makeup team arrived exactly at 4, transforming my suite into an impromptu salon. There were three of them: a woman who immediately began assessing my hair, a man who studied my face with the intensity of a sculptor examining marble, and another woman who appeared with a rolling rack of evening gowns. "Mr. Volkov wasn't sure of your size," the woman with the dresses said apologetically. "So we brought several options." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. My husband didn't know my dress size because he'd never bothered to ask, had probably never even thought about it. Instead, I let them work, sitting still while they transformed me into someone I didn't recognize. The dress they finally chose was midnight blue, made of some silky fabric that draped elegantly and made me feel like I was wearing liquid starlight. It had a high neckline and long sleeves but was cut to flatter in subtle ways that made me look older, more sophisticated. The makeup artist gave me dramatic eyes and a nude lip, while the hairstylist pulled my long dark hair into an elegant updo that exposed my neck and shoulders. When they finally let me look in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The girl looking back at me was polished and glamorous, someone who belonged in Damien's world. But beneath the makeup and the expensive dress, I was still just Lena Chen, the girl who'd been sold to settle a debt. "You look beautiful," Elena said quietly from the doorway. "Mr. Volkov is waiting in the foyer." Of course he was. Heaven forbid his new acquisition was late. I made my way downstairs carefully, not used to walking in heels this high. Damien stood at the bottom of the staircase, checking his watch with obvious impatience. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than a year of my college tuition, his hair perfectly styled, looking every inch the powerful man he was. When he glanced up and saw me descending the stairs, something flickered across his face: surprise, maybe appreciation, but it was gone before I could be sure. "You clean up well," he said flatly, as if commenting on the weather. "Thanks. You look nice too." The sarcasm in my voice was barely concealed, but if he noticed, he didn't react. He held out his arm, and I took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath his expensive suit. "Remember what I told you in the car. Smile, be gracious, say as little as possible. These people are sharks, and they'll be looking for any weakness. Don't give them one." "I understand. Do you?" He looked down at me, his gray eyes searching mine. "Because if you embarrass me tonight, if you say or do anything that makes me look weak, there will be consequences. I don't care about your father's debt being forgiven. I'll find other ways to make your family regret this arrangement. Am I clear?" The threat was delivered in the same calm, measured tone he used for everything else, which somehow made it more terrifying. This was who Damien Volkov really was: not the handsome face or the elegant manners, but the cold, calculating man beneath who would destroy anyone who threatened his position. "Crystal clear," I replied, matching his tone. Something that might have been approval flickered in his expression. "Good. Let's go." The dinner party was being held at an estate even larger than Damien's, a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been imported from a European countryside. Cars lined the circular drive as we arrived, expensive vehicles that probably cost more than most houses. Damien kept my arm locked in his as we walked toward the entrance, his posture relaxed but alert, like a soldier walking into potential combat. "Whose house is this?" I whispered. "Viktor Reznikov's. He's the head of the Russian syndicate. We've had a complicated relationship over the years. This dinner is meant to solidify a recent truce." He glanced down at me. "Which is why you need to be perfect tonight. A lot is riding on this." "No pressure then. Just perform flawlessly at a dinner party hosted by the head of a criminal organization to celebrate a truce with my mafia boss husband. Totally normal Thursday night." The interior of the house was even more opulent than Damien's: all gold accents and crystal chandeliers and artwork that belonged in museums. A servant took our coats, and then we were being led into a reception room where at least 50 people were already mingling, champagne flutes in hand, and false smiles on their faces. Every head turned as we entered. I felt the weight of their stares, felt them assessing and judging and calculating. Damien's hand tightened on my arm, a warning or a reassurance. I couldn't tell which. "Damien!" Finally, a booming voice cut through the murmur of conversation, and a large man with a graying beard approached us, arms outstretched. This had to be Viktor Reznikov. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about joining us. Victor, thank you for the invitation. Damien's voice was warm, friendly even, but I could feel the tension in his body. I'd like you to meet my wife. Lena, this is Victor Reznikov. Victor's eyes locked onto me with unsettling intensity, and I suddenly understood what Damien had meant about sharks. This man was dangerous, and he was studying me like I was a puzzle he needed to solve. Your wife, Victor repeated slowly. Yes, I heard rumors about a sudden wedding. How? Romantic. The way he said it made clear he found nothing romantic about our arrangement. Tell me, my dear, how does a girl from the Chen family end up married to the great Damien Volkov? The question was a trap, designed to make me stumble, to reveal too much or say something that would give him leverage. I felt Damien tense beside me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I smiled the gracious, empty smile I'd seen on politicians' wives and met Victor's gaze directly. Sometimes the most unexpected things turn out to be exactly what we need. I'm very fortunate. Fortunate, Victor echoed, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to break some of the tension. She's clever, this one. You've done well, Damien. Come, both of you. There are people you must meet. The next hour was a blur of introductions and careful conversations. I met men and women whose names I recognized from news reports about organized crime, shook hands with people who smiled warmly while their eyes remained cold and calculating. Through it all, Damien stayed at my side, his hand a constant presence at the small of my back, guiding me through the social minefield. I watched the way he moved through these interactions, the careful balance of power and diplomacy. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny, complimented people he clearly despised, made promises that were deliberately vague. And I realized this was his real skill, not violence or intimidation, but this ability to navigate these treacherous social waters, to make allies of enemies, and keep everyone slightly off balance. You're doing well, he murmured in my ear during a brief moment when we were alone. Better than I expected. Don't sound so surprised. I told you I wasn't an idiot. No, he agreed, something shifting in his expression. You're definitely not that. Before I could respond, we were being ushered into the dining room for dinner. The table was enormous, set with more silverware than I'd ever seen at one place setting. Damien pulled out my chair for me, a gesture of politeness that felt performative, designed to show the other guests how attentive he was, then took his own seat beside me. The meal was a study in excess, course after course of elaborate dishes, each more complex than the last, accompanied by wines that probably cost more than my monthly college tuition. The conversation flowed around me, talk of business and territory and deals that were clearly criminal, but discussed with the same casual tone people might use to discuss the weather. I was pushing some kind of fish around my plate, trying to look like I was eating while my stomach churned with anxiety, when the woman across from me spoke. So, Mrs. Volkov, what do you do? I assume you have some sort of profession? Every conversation at the table seemed to pause. I could feel Damien stiffen beside me, feel everyone waiting for my answer. This was another test, another chance to reveal something that could be used against us. I was studying education, I said carefully. I wanted to be a teacher. Wanted to be? The woman's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. Does marriage to Damien mean the end of those aspirations? It was a loaded question. If I said yes, I looked weak, a woman who'd given up her dreams for a man. If I said no, I risked implying that this marriage wasn't my priority, that I had other interests. I glanced at Damien, but his expression gave nothing away. Marriage doesn't mean the end of anything, I said finally. It means the beginning of something new. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can figure out how to balance both. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. How diplomatic. Damien has taught you well already. Actually, Damien interjected smoothly. Lena is naturally tactful. One of the many qualities I admire about her. His hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. To anyone watching, it looked like an affectionate gesture from a devoted husband. I knew it was really a warning to keep my guard up. The rest of the dinner passed in similar fashion, questions that were really interrogations, compliments that were really insults, all wrapped in a veneer of civility. By the time dessert was served, my face hurt from smiling and my head ached from the constant vigilance required to navigate every conversation. Finally, mercifully, the evening began to wind down. Guests started making their departures, and Damien guided me toward the exit with his hand firmly at my back. Victor intercepted us at the door, his large frame blocking our path. "Damien, a word?" He glanced at me. "In private. Anything you need to say can be said in front of my wife." Damien replied, his tone brooking no argument. Victor's expression shifted, a flash of something dangerous before his jovial mask slipped back into place. Of course, of course. I simply wanted to say that I approve. Your new bride is quite impressive. Beautiful, intelligent, poised. You've chosen well. I know. Good. Because you understand, of course, that this truce between our families is built on trust. Any deception, any secrets, any hint that you're not being entirely honest with me. He let the threat hang in the air, unsaid but crystal clear. I understand perfectly, Damien said coldly. And I trust you understand that the same applies to you. This peace benefits us both. Let's not do anything to jeopardize it. The two men stared at each other, and the air between them crackled with tension. I held my breath, half expecting violence to erupt right there in the foyer. Then Victor laughed and clapped Damien on the shoulder. Of course, my friend. Of course. Enjoy your evening. And congratulations again on your marriage. We didn't speak until we were in the car, the mansion disappearing behind us in the darkness. Damien loosened his tie and ran a hand through his hair, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. What did he mean about secrets? I asked quietly. Victor thinks there's more to our marriage than I've told him. He's fishing for information, trying to find leverage. Damien turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dim interior of the car. You did well tonight, better than I expected. Those people are trained to find weaknesses, and you didn't give them anything to work with. Coming from him, it was practically a glowing compliment. So, I passed your test? For now, but this is just the beginning, Lena. There will be more dinners, more gatherings, more opportunities for you to make a mistake. You'll need to be vigilant every day, every moment. Can you do that? I thought about the alternative going back home, watching my family struggle under the weight of that debt, knowing I'd failed them. I don't have a choice, do I? No, he agreed. You don't. But then, neither do I. Something in the way he said it made me wonder what secrets Damien Volkov was hiding. What had driven him to need a wife so desperately that he'd agree to marry a stranger to settle someone else's debt? But before I could ask, he'd turned away, pulling out his phone and effectively ending the conversation. I spent the rest of the ride back to the mansion, staring out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and wondering what kind of life I'd signed up for. One thing was certain: nothing about this arrangement was going to be simple. And the man sitting beside me, my husband in name only, was far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up in that enormous bed, with no idea where I was for a few disorienting seconds. Then reality crashed back: the wedding, the mansion, the dinner party, all of it. I was Mrs. Damien Volkov now, and this was my new life. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating my suite in shades of gold. I checked my phone and found several missed calls from my mother and a string of worried text messages. With shaking hands, I called her back. Lena? Oh, thank God. I've been so worried. I'm fine, Mom. Really? I'm okay. The lie tasted bitter, but what else could I say? That I was trapped in a loveless marriage to a criminal? That I'd spent last night surrounded by people who smiled while discussing murder and extortion? How are you? How's Dad? He's managing. Her voice was thick with tears. Lena, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. There is no other way. And it's already done. I'm married, Mom. The debt is forgiven. That's what matters. We talked for a few more minutes, my mother crying and apologizing while I tried to reassure her that everything was fine. When I finally hung up, I felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Elena entered with a breakfast tray, her expression sympathetic. "Good morning, Mrs. Volkov. I thought you might like to eat in your room today, mister." Volkov has already left for his office. Of course he had. My husband couldn't even bother to check on me the morning after I'd played my role perfectly at his important dinner. I should have been relieved. I certainly didn't want to sit across a breakfast table making awkward conversation, but instead I felt dismissed. Like I'd served my purpose and was now being set aside until needed again. "Thank you, Elena." I accepted the tray, laden with more food than I could possibly eat. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How long have you worked here?" 5 years. I started when Mr. Volkov first bought this house. "What's he like when there aren't strangers around to impress?" Elena hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "He's demanding but fair. He expects excellence but rewards loyalty. And he's intensely private. Most of the staff have worked here for years because he treats us well, but very few people actually know him." She paused. "He's not an easy man, Mrs. Volkov. But he's not cruel either. Just guarded." Guarded. That was one way to describe someone who'd married a stranger and couldn't even pretend to care. "Thank you for being honest." After Elena left, I picked at the breakfast and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with myself. In my old life, I'd be in class right now, or studying at the library, or maybe grabbing coffee with friends. Here, I had nothing. No purpose, no responsibilities, no idea how to fill the endless hours stretching ahead. I spent the day exploring the mansion, wandering through rooms that were more like museum exhibits than lived-in spaces. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a home gym that looked like it belonged in a professional sports facility, a screening room with plush recliners, even an indoor pool. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly impersonal. The only room that felt remotely lived in was Damien's study, which I found at the end of a long hallway on the first floor. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't resist peeking inside. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed signs of actual use: papers scattered across a massive desk, books pulled from shelves and stacked on various surfaces, a leather chair that looked worn and comfortable. This was where Damien spent his time, where he did whatever mysterious work occupied him. I was about to leave when something caught my eye: a photograph on one of the bookshelves. It showed a younger Damien, maybe in his early 20s, standing with his arm around a beautiful woman with long blonde hair. They were both smiling, genuinely happy, and there was an intimacy in the way they leaned into each other that made my chest tighten with an emotion I didn't want to name. "That's none of your business." I spun around to find Damien standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. He must have come home while I was exploring, and now I'd been caught snooping in his private space. "I'm sorry, I was just what? Invading my privacy?" "This room is off-limits, Lena. Everything in here is off-limits. Is that understood?" "Yes, I'm sorry. I was bored and wandering around, and then find something to occupy yourself that doesn't involve going through my things." He stalked into the room, effectively blocking my exit. "You have an entire mansion at your disposal. Surely you can find something to do that doesn't require invading my space." His anger felt disproportionate to what I'd done, which made me think that photograph was more significant than it appeared. "Who is she? The woman in the picture?" For a moment, I thought he might actually answer. Something flickered in his eyes: pain, maybe, or regret. Then, his expression hardened. "Someone who has nothing to do with you. Now get out." I fled the study, my cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. He'd been the one to force me into this situation, had pulled me out of my life and installed me in this golden cage, and now he was angry that I was trying to understand the man I'd married? It was ridiculous. But it also made me realize something important. Damien Volkov had secrets, and whatever they were connected to that woman in the photograph. And despite his warnings, despite everything, I was curious. Because if I was going to survive this marriage, I needed to understand who my husband really was. And why someone who looked capable of genuine happiness in that old photograph had become the cold, distant man who could barely stand to look at me. I went back upstairs to my suite, but found myself unable to settle. That photograph haunted me: the warmth in Damien's eyes, the ease in his smile. What had happened to turn him into the man he was now? And why had he needed to marry me so urgently that he'd been willing to pay off $1 million debt? That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining room. To my surprise, Damien actually joined me, taking his seat at the head of the absurdly long table while I sat to his right. A place setting for two at a table built for 20, it would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. We ate in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against china. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Are we going to do this every night? Sit here in complete silence, pretending the other doesn't exist? Damien looked up from his plate, his expression mildly surprised, as if he'd forgotten I was there. Would you prefer I make small talk? Ask about your day? I'd prefer you treat me like a human being instead of a piece of furniture you're obligated to acknowledge occasionally. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. You're more outspoken than I expected. Yeah. Well, I'm full of surprises. What did you expect exactly? That I'd just sit here quietly and be grateful you let me live in your mansion? Yes, actually. That was the arrangement. The arrangement, I repeated bitterly. You keep calling it that, like I'm some kind of business contract instead of your wife. You are a business contract. Let's not pretend this is anything else. He set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying me with those unreadable gray eyes. I paid off your father's debt. In exchange, you agreed to marry me and fulfill certain duties, appearing at my side when necessary, maintaining this household, presenting the image of a happily married couple. That's all this is. Then, why? The question burst out of me before I could stop it. Why did you need a wife so badly? Why marry a stranger when you obviously don't want one? That's not your concern. I think it is. I gave up my entire life for this arrangement. Don't I deserve to know why? For a long moment, he just stared at me, and I could see him weighing his options whether to tell me the truth or send me away with another dismissive comment. Finally, he sighed. My father built this empire from nothing. When he died 3 years ago, leadership of the family fell to me. I was 30, unmarried, and according to the old guard, too young and too reckless to be trusted with that kind of power. He paused, his jaw tightening. There was a faction that wanted to replace me with my cousin, a man who would have destroyed everything my father built within a year. The only way to solidify my position was to show stability, maturity, commitment. A wife. So I'm a prop. A way to convince people you're responsible. Essentially, yes. He said it without apology, without any acknowledgement of how insulting that was. And it's working. Viktor Reznikov's dinner party was a test. He wanted to see if this marriage was legitimate, if you were real or just some paid actress. You convinced him. That truce, which is worth millions and prevents a bloody war, holds because you played your part well. I should have felt some satisfaction in that I'd done what he'd asked. Had performed perfectly. Instead, I just felt hollow. And what happens when people stop questioning your stability? When you've held power long enough that you don't need a wife to prove anything? Do I get discarded like an old prop that's outlived its usefulness? Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or respect. I don't know, he admitted. I haven't thought that far ahead. Well, that's reassuring. I pushed back from the table, suddenly unable to sit there any longer. Thank you for the honesty. At least, now I know exactly where I stand. I started to leave, but his voice stopped me. Lena. I turned back reluctantly. You asked about the woman in the photograph. Her name was Isabel. She was my fiancée. She died 4 years ago. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken emotion. I waited for him to continue, to explain, but he just returned his attention to his plate, the conversation clearly over. I went back to my suite and didn't come out for the rest of the night. The days settled into a strange routine. I saw Damien in the mornings occasionally, when he happened to be in the kitchen during breakfast, and sometimes at dinner, though just as often he ate in his study or didn't come home at all. He was polite but distant, treating me with the same careful courtesy he might show a business associate. We orbited each other like planets in separate spheres, sharing space but never really connecting. I tried to fill my days with something meaningful. I explored the library and started reading the classics I'd never had time for during college. I swam laps in the indoor pool. until my muscles ached. I even started helping Elena with household tasks, much to her confusion, because sitting idle in my suite all day made me feel like I was slowly disappearing. 2 weeks after the wedding, my mother called with good news. "Your father got a new job," she said, her voice lighter than I'd heard it in years. "Better pay, better hours. And Kai got that scholarship he applied for. Everything's getting better, Lena. Because of you." I cried after we hung up, though I wasn't sure if the tears were from relief or grief. My sacrifice was worth it. My family was thriving, free from the weight of that debt. But I was trapped here, in this beautiful prison, married to a ghost of a man who was still in love with someone who'd been dead for 4 years. That night, there was another event, a charity gala, at a downtown hotel. Damien knocked on my door at 6, looking devastating in a tuxedo, to escort me downstairs where the car was waiting. "You'll need this," he said, holding out a jewelry box. Inside was a necklace that made my breath catch, diamonds and sapphires arranged in an intricate pattern, clearly worth more than most houses. "I can't wear that," I breathed. "You're my wife. People expect to see you wearing jewelry like this. Consider it part of the costume." He took it from the box and moved behind me, fastening it around my neck. His fingers brushed against my skin, and I felt a shock of awareness that caught me off guard. It was the first time he'd touched me since the wedding, and my body seemed to have a reaction completely independent of my mind. In the car, he briefed me on who would be at the gala, which people to avoid and which to charm. I listened with half my attention, the rest focused on the weight of the necklace at my throat and the memory of his fingers against my neck. "Are you listening?" Damien asked, his tone sharp. "Yes. Charm the mayor's wife, avoid the district attorney, smile but don't engage with anyone from the Marchetti family. I've got it." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. This event is important. Several major players will be there, and they'll all be watching us, looking for cracks in the facade. We need to appear united, devoted even." "How devoted are we talking?" "Convincingly in love." I almost laughed. "You want me to pretend I'm in love with you? I barely know you." "Then you'd better be a good actress." There was no humor in his voice, just that cold practicality that characterized everything about him. "Smile at me like I'm the most important person in the room. Laugh at my jokes. Touch my arm occasionally. Basic affection, Lena. Can you manage that?" "For the right motivation, I can manage anything." His eyebrow arched. "What motivation is that?" "Knowing my family is safe and happy. That's all the motivation I need." Something shifted in his expression, respect, maybe, or understanding. "Then we'll both play our parts." The gala was even more extravagant than Victor's dinner party. The hotel ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, all gold and white with enormous flower arrangements and crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of people in designer gowns and expensive tuxedos mingled beneath the glittering lights, champagne flowing freely. Damien took my hand as we entered, lacing his fingers through mine in a gesture that looked natural but felt calculated. I could feel eyes on us immediately, could sense the whispers and speculation. This was what we'd come for, to be seen, to project an image of a strong, united couple. Mr. Volkov and the new Mrs. Volkov. A woman in a silver gown approached us, her smile bright, but her eyes cold. "How wonderful to finally meet you. I'm Catherine Sterling. My husband and I are old friends of Damien's family." "It's lovely to meet you," I said warmly, channeling every lesson I'd learned at Victor's dinner. "Damien's told me so much about you." Which was a complete lie. I'd never